Welcome to Coming from Left Field, where we have conversations about politics, books, and current events with your host, Greg Goddles and Pat Cummings. Moms for Liberty, founded in 2021 by two women self-described as joyful warriors, advocates for parental rights and education. They claim that most of their funding comes from T-shirt sales, and the group's remarkable expansion is the result of grassroots populist appeal. Really now. With a little digging, one finds that, soon after forming, they received unusually quick amplification in the far-right media. And it appears that they have been funded with wheelbarrows full of dark money from a who's who of extreme right players. Then there's the book banning, targeting teachers' unions, harassing public school boards, critical race theory, moral panic, and more, much more. Let's discuss. Warm greetings. We are back for another podcast with our very good friend Walker Bragman. Is it Walker or Walt? I have in my notes Walter, but you are Walker, so I hope I don't keep getting that wrong.
You know, literally everybody makes that mistake.
Okay.
More so, I think, since the Breaking Bad show came out, because everybody loved Breaking Bad, and that but before that, the closest like mainstream, I guess, version of my name was Walker Texas Ranger. I got that a lot, and then when Breaking Bad happened, I started getting Walter a lot. So. Yeah.
Well, you are a very good journalist, and I just discovered you a couple of just recently. You write for The Hill, Truth Out, Salon, OptOut Media, which is very good, and then a wonderful blog that you post to, and I'll make links to this in the show. I just strongly recommend people following you. Your post today was quite remarkable. We'll talk about that as it relates to this particular situation.
We try to avoid the blog word. It's
Substack.
You prefer newsletter. It's not opinion pieces. They are reported articles. So
that's right. They are very.
Thank you. I appreciate your kind words.
Yeah. So I need to get a little bit of background. We're going to be talking about Moms for Liberty, and this I have been following what is going on in a school district very close to me, and have been a member of a Facebook group, which is quite prolific in their posting. And they post anti-vax, sex education, CRT, just the normal anti-union things. The other day, I was watching a YouTube video of the school board member there, and these mothers after mothers were coming up just berating the school board regarding sex education and different policies. And I saw the shirt Moms for Liberty, and I didn't make the connection for it. So literally, I Googled Moms for Liberty and found your very good article. The grassroots parent rights groups get big mystery money. And I just felt like an idiot that I hadn't made any of these connections from these aggressive school board parents, very actively harming what I think is quite a remarkably good school district, and this dark money that seems to be propping them up. That's my introduction. Tell me how you came across this.
So I've been reporting on the dark money efforts to shape the pandemic safety discussion, and I had initially reported on the discussion about lockdowns. So, as everybody probably remembers, early on in the pandemic, a number of states, most states, I think, issued stay-at-home orders. These lasted, basically, none of them lasted more than a few weeks, but they saw non-essential business closures. And some of them lingered. Some closures lingered for longer, but generally speaking, they were relatively short-lived. Now, during the closures were economically disruptive. I mean, major sectors of the economy, namely hospitality, took major hits. And so almost immediately you start to see groups like those in billionaire Charles Koch's political network start coming out and saying, we got to enable the country to reopen. We gotta reopen America. We got to get things back to normal. This is harm reduction from their perspective. Even though the virus is still circulating, even though it's killing thousands of people every week, from the perspective of capital, you got to get things back to normal, because if you don't, the short term losses are going to be just astronomical, and it could carry on for years and years and years.
Right.
I think McKinsey said that some of the most impacted, a McKinsey report from the consultancy that everybody now associates with Pete Buttigieg, but is actually a really major consultancy with some of the largest companies in the world as clients, put out a report saying that some of the hardest hit sectors of the economy will take years to recover. Now, if you're a very wealthy person looking at your portfolio, this is not something you want to hear. And if that's your main concern, this is not something you want to hear. So groups, business aligned groups start coming out against lockdowns early on in 2020. What's interesting is that schools would become, I think, an even a hot button issue that of even greater potency than the lockdown stuff. But that wouldn't happen for some time. Initially, groups, these right-wing dark money groups, kind of looked at school closures as a positive thing. There was a piece written by Virginia Gentles of the Independent Women's Forum, which is a co-funded operation, that basically said school closures are going to be less stressful for homeschooling is less stressful for kids. It's better for parents. It's going to be, you're going to find that your life is better without having to go into the public schools every day, and like there's less, and that was early on in the pandemic. Of course, in April 2020, a report from McKinsey comes out that says if we want to tap into the full productive capacity of the workforce, we got to open schools, because 27 million Americans rely on childcare to work. Schools are childcare. So the economy was, the recovery was very sluggish, and labor force participation was not coming back, even though the lockdown measures ended, even though they did that. So you start to see a push from the right to reopen schools, and you start to see these narratives that school closures represent this undue harm to children. That would evolve into school mask mandates as well. Oh, we can't have the masks. Any kind of reminder of the pandemic, that there's a pandemic going on, has to go, because we got to get back to normal. So Virginia Gentles, by the way, who I mentioned, wrote that piece about how great homeschooling was and how wonderful the closures could be. She recently testified before the House subcommittee on the coronavirus crisis, and her testimony was all about the harms of school closures. So it's really, you can see the progression here. And Moms for Liberty is one of these groups that sprung up in opposition to closures. It was founded in Florida in I believe January of 2021. It was formally established. The founders were current and former school board members. It was Tiffany Justice and Tina Descovich, two Florida school board moms, and then also they were joined by Bridget Ziegler, who was a Sarasota County school board member, and whose husband was very well connected in Florida politics. Almost immediately, Moms for Liberty gets picked up by right-wing media.
You mentioned Rush Limbaugh, Fox
Yeah.
News, Steve Bannon, Breitbart, Glenn Beck, Tucker Carlson.
Yep.
Just immediately, prolifically, they are on all these shows.
Yep, all of them. And as somebody who has I have a nonprofit. We mentioned earlier the OptOut Media Foundation. It's hard to start a nonprofit group and raise raise money and do the kinds of things that you need to do. Get publicity. Publicity is very tough. Even though I think what we do is we offer some pretty cool services. We have a free news app that's available on iOS and Android. It's all independent media. You can scroll through, make your own feed. There's no algorithm. There's no native advertising. We're not selling your data. It's just a clean news experience from independent media. Anyway, like even with a good product, I think it's very hard to get publicity. So the fact that this group, this like was able to just get all of that immediately is suspicious. They also were amplified and elevated by Ron DeSantis, who recently declared his candidacy for the 2024 presidential race. DeSantis is somebody who, the more you read about this stuff, the more you learn about the COVID misinformation sphere, like the groups that are pushing COVID misinformation to get everything back to normal. DeSantis is very enmeshed with those efforts. And he appears at Moms for Liberty's convention and receives an award from Moms for Liberty for being so aggressive in pushing normalcy. Now, Moms for Liberty has said that it's a grassroots organization. They've said that most of their funding comes from T-shirt sales, which is not true at all. In fact, a substantial amount of their funding comes from large donations. This is a pattern with these groups. Another organization, which I may do a write-up of this, but another organization that's similar to Moms for Liberty, Parents Defending Education, got a $250,000 donation from the Searle Freedom Trust. So that's a little bit of original reporting here on your podcast.
Well, the not just conservative groups, other groups. Like I'm in close to Seattle, and I've seen the impact of the Gates Foundation's money just flowing into these groups that are supposedly these grassroots groups, but all of a sudden they are following the exact line of what Gates wants them to, of teacher evaluations and testing and so forth. So
Right.
but it's hard.
Gates,
it's hard to see who's real and who's not real because of the way the funding's set up. You don't know who are these people.
Well, the Gates Foundation, is another one of these. They also have an interest in privatizing schools. I mean, really, the effort to raise hell about COVID mitigations in schools isn't really about the kids. At its core, it has three main goals. The first is the economy, getting parents back to work, having the that daycare system in place. That's number one. That's the goal for the money. That's their goal. That's who's behind it. Another goal is undermining public education. You have to remember that capital interests, right-wing capital interests, have long hated public education. They've long supported privatization. Now, Bill Gates as well is an advocate for alternatives to public education. But like the Koch groups, they really want to do away with public education. And the third goal is undermining labor, teachers unions in particular. So that's where this push to sort of radicalize parents around school closures comes from. Now, they targeted sort of middle to upper middle class white parents who, for the first time, really are, oh shoot, we have to, like, I've got to really, really balance like raising my child with work. I think that people from lower income backgrounds, I think, had a much better handle on the situation than sort of well-off white parents. That's just my own speculation, but white parents immediately were the ones who most quickly were like, we got to get the kids back to school. Now, a lot of moms had been forced out of the workforce, and that plays into this. But so these groups that were sort of we got to get everything open, we got to get back to normal. That was their demographic. This is their wedge issue. And Moms for Liberty is a testament to that.
Before you were going on, Greg and I was talking, we're talking about that. The fact that it's the affluent districts that are being taken over by these groups, not not where Tacoma, where I'm at, the urban districts. Then that just
Yeah.
shows the links to the politics of it all too.
Here in Pittsburgh, today there was a story out in an affluent suburb, Southville suburb, that this is what they're dealing with, and it's in fact Moms for Liberty that are well organized. It's a very affluent district. It's virtually all white, not all white, but almost all white. And the rest of the city really hasn't seen this phenomenon. It's just in this one particular community. Is that typical? Is it really typical that that's, and why do you suppose that is?
Yeah, so that is sort of what the polling has suggested. You know, every so often there's a poll about there was a now that schools are mostly open, these polls have stopped. But when they were doing polling on this and schools were reopening and balancing COVID mitigations, you found the most support for COVID mitigations, remote learning. You found that among parents of color. And it's skewed less white, and it's skewed lower lower income. And I think there are several reasons for that. I think that these are families who were hit hardest by the pandemic. They a lot of these families live in multi-generational homes. That's another aspect of it. So a kid brings home COVID, they could infect older members of their household, more vulnerable members of their household. These well-off, sort of white parents, they're less likely to live in multi-generational housing. So I think that's an aspect of it. Also, experiences with the healthcare system, I think, matter, and experiences with public schooling. I think that these sort of more affluent communities have better experiences overall with the healthcare, because of systemic racism in this country, have better experiences with our institutions, healthcare, with our healthcare system as well, than families of color. So I think that plays into it as well. But yeah, so it really, we saw this emerge, this sort of divide between the well-off and white folks, and then sort of everybody else. The group that was driving the policy discussion, well-off white folks. That's just another, I think, testament to
here in Pittsburgh. It's really LGBTQ issues that the Moms for Liberty are up in arms about. That's their salient, that's their front. And I guess in other places it's critical race theory, or the whole book. Is there a demographic? Can you break that down? I mean, where is it one the most important? Where is another the most important? Is there any kind of clues to that?
I think it depends. Look, as the pandemic stuff is, we're in a lull period right now with COVID, and who knows how long it'll last, or if we'll get another bad variant. Who knows? But as the COVID stuff has sort of faded from the popular discourse, that's not to say, that's not to say that COVID is not still an issue. It very much is, especially for the immunocompromised and the vulnerable. Absolutely, people should be taking precautions. But from the popular discourse, COVID has faded. That is, major media outlets have kind of moved on, and you can look at the demographics of the journalists, the socioeconomic status of the reporters who are on television, and in the Washington Post and the New York Times, and I think that provides some insight into why that is. Sort of fits into the same trends that we see with the school board moms, like who supports remote learning, who supports mitigations, and who doesn't. Again, well-off white, probably less supportive of mitigation efforts. Now, in terms of critical race theory and anti-LGBTQIA plus stuff, Moms for Liberty embraced that almost out of the gate. So while while the closures due to COVID were the impetus for the impetus for founding this group, the Moms for Liberty founders also took issue with the school curriculum. They said, the closures were the first time we really got to look at what our kids are learning in school, and it was really bad, and like we got to do something about it. So Moms for Liberty is viciously anti-trans, anti-critical race theory, anti-history. They essentially are a far-right group of angry parents that are known for their extremely aggressive tactics at school board meetings. I think, because they are a national group now, chapters are different. They have different priorities. I can't say why one chapter would focus more on one thing than another, but really it's the link between COVID denial and bigotry. Culture war bigotry, and they've pushed for book bans. They're a really parents who don't want their kids to be indoctrinated into right wing, who don't want schools to be taken over by far right wing malcontents, I guess you could say, should actively organize against this group, and in many places they are. It's just unfortunate that Moms for Liberty is so well funded. The money is definitely on the right, and that's a situation that we face across issues.
Like I said, I didn't make the connection between this Facebook group, Informed Parents of Washington Peninsula School District, that I've been a member of for a year or so, but it's a closed group. You have to be brought into the group. I'll probably be kicked off the group now after this podcast, but my initial posts with them were regarding their vaccine stuff. They were just posting stuff that was just horrible. It was so wrong. Yep. And touting all of these these doctors that you Google the doctors, and they're QAnon doctors, they're just nuts. And that was what most of the conversation was how harmful the teachers union was.
Funny about that, right?
Forcing this horrible teachers union. Although I did notice, Greg, you'll be pleased. I did notice they posted just recently, yesterday, that they're Marxists. Oklahoma's top educator officially wages war against teachers union. He says that they're all Marxists. I thought you'd be glad to know that all the teachers in Oklahoma are Marxist.
Yeah.
Greg.
Happy to hear that.
Yeah, glad to hear.
But
now it's all now it's all sex. Now it's all sex. It's all condoms on bananas, and you're grooming our children.
Yeah,
these it is horrible. It's just horrible.
It's such toxic bull. Can I
swear? Yes, you can.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah, it's toxic bullshit, and it's baseless. And again, I just want to highlight the DeSantis connection here, because DeSantis has made himself a leading figure among this sort of disinformation, anti-vax right. I think for DeSantis, there are several reasons for him sort of branding himself that way. Namely, Donald Trump has somewhat stood by the vaccines because they were developed by, his administration helped facilitate the development with Operation Warp Speed, which by all accounts was a success. For all of his faults, Operation Warp Speed was a success. But the base of the party, and in no small part thanks to Trump himself, have sort of rejected vaccines in favor of sort of quack cures. And Trump is now in a sort of interesting position where he's like, the vaccines are great, we delivered the vaccines, but also his base is now largely anti-vax. And I think DeSantis has capitalized on that. He is cozied up to right-wing operatives and fringe scientists. He put, for example, there's Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who is a professor at Stanford University. He's basically an economist, who's one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. Now, we're getting technical. The Great Barrington Declaration was an open letter from October 2020 published by a libertarian think tank, and it essentially called for letting COVID spread. Like, don't do anything, don't lock down.
Herd immunity.
Herd immunity through infection and focused protection, which is cover your ass language for do nothing and let it rip. So DeSantis has cozied up to Bhattacharya and his co-author, one of his co-authors, Martin Kulldorff. When the Urgency of Normal toolkit came out, this was a bunch of doctors who were not child development experts put out a toolkit saying closures are causing developmental harm to children. He's also cozied up to that crowd as well. Tracy Beth Hoeg, who was one of the authors of the Urgency of Normal. She's now a state epidemiologist for DeSantis, even though she her practice was in physical medicine. She's not really an her publications in epidemiology are very limited and very recent, but she does have a degree. She has a degree in epidemiology, so technically she meets the, I guess, qualification for an epidemiologist. He also put Joe Ladapo in charge of, he's now his Surgeon General. Joe Ladapo is affiliated with America's Frontline Doctors, which is an anti-vax, pro-Trump doctor group. And so you see DeSantis sort of stripping away these people from Trump. The Great Barrington Declaration folks were advising the Trump administration on its COVID response. Ladapo was as well. There is a photograph of Ladapo, Martin Kulldorff, and Jay Bhattacharya in the Oval Office with Donald Trump, and now they're DeSantis allies. Bhattacharya was a speaker on DeSantis's Twitter space with Elon Musk, where he announced his candidacy. So for DeSantis, it's political. All of this, what we're seeing now is misinformation weaponized for politics, and Moms for Liberty is an arm of that. It's a group meant to radicalize parents with misinformed parents, and get them out and get them angry and intimidate school boards and force the kinds of changes that you couldn't run on, you couldn't get elected on. And so I think that's sort of what we're seeing. It's extremely troubling, and of course one of their enemies are the teachers' unions. It's no surprise given the kind of money that is backing these ventures. Now, I should clarify, we don't know who is funding Moms for Liberty, who the major donors are. We do know that in 2022, the Heritage Foundation awarded a grant to Moms for Liberty. Heritage is a Koch-funded, DC-based libertarian think tank, one of the most well-known. It gets money from all sorts of wealthy interests, including Koch, and of course they're going to be anti-labor.
And almost all of the Moms for Liberty document is just cut and paste from the Heritage Foundation's stuff.
Yeah. So it's important to know that you're not fighting. These parents, while they're radicalized and they themselves are not political operatives, they're what we call useful idiots for a right-wing billionaire backed agenda. That's what they are.
It's a curious thing, since World War II, the educational system, the schools have been a battleground in this country. I mean, with desegregation, basically all the social issues really came to bear on our school systems and our school districts and our educational system. Europe has lots of right-wing movements. Really powerful right-wing movements. But you never really hear much, and I kind of follow some of the European media, of this kind of combat within the school systems, the way it is in this country. Boris Johnson had, everyone was electrified over Brexit and other issues, anti-immigrant stuff in Europe, but you don't find that kind of real intense warfare in the school systems the way it is here. The school systems have been a battleground. Like I say, 1954, school desegregation, on and on and on. You have any idea why that is? Is there any reason why is it so ugly here?
Well, in the 1970s, I believe, Justice Powell put out the Powell Memorandum, which was basically an instruction manual, a guide for right-wing capital interests to wage a counter-revolution. And it recommended going after academic institutions. It recommended going after media, basically building alternatives to the liberal mainstream, which had been taken over, of course, by radicals and whatnot. So we are seeing that play out. The ways that right-wing capital is fighting, is waging its war, I think, on this country. I should say, they don't view it that way, but every major development that this country has had in the last 100 years is subject to attack by right-wing capital. That goes to child labor laws, our regulatory state, our welfare state, social security. All of it has come under attack. Public education has come under attack. They're following a playbook that was laid out, and doing so, I think, effectively. They're going after the courts. All of the major gains that this country had in the last 100 years, all of the major developments, are subject to attack by the right. And I think that's truly frightening, because they are a minority in this country, but they have all the money. All, not all of it. That's hyperbolic, but they have a hell of a lot of money, and they're using it. They are using it to undermine our institutions and our government and weaken it. I mean, look at what Florida is doing now with targeting gay people and targeting trans people. That shouldn't hold up in court, but they've hijacked the judiciary.
Right.
The federal government should be able to should come in and backstop it with federal civil rights legislation protecting LGBTQIA plus people from discrimination. But we can't do that because Congress is really gerrymandered, which gives an advantage to the minority party. And gerrymandering, the court is allowed. You're allowed to do it. And they've weakened the protections of the Voting Rights Act. So you can get these really aggressive right-wing gerrymanders that disempower communities of color. There's no ability now, or limited ability. I shouldn't say no ability, because I think Democrats could be fighting a lot harder than they are. But we have, in many ways, minority rule in this country by a small, well-funded minority. In 1976, the Supreme Court passed the Buckley versus Vallejo. It came down with the Buckley versus Vallejo decision, which said that spending money is a protected form of speech under the First Amendment, and therefore outside political spending, not direct contributions to candidates, but political spending. Say, if you wanted to run ads yourself on issues, you can't limit that. There can be no limit. So the effect that has is empowering capital, very wealthy Americans, to speak a whole lot louder than regular people. And then in 2010, that you see the natural extension of that. Corporations now have those same rights, corporations and nonprofits. So you see a rise in dark money groups. And it is an aggressive, anti-democratic counter-revolution being waged in the US, and people are not aware of it to the extent that they need to be. We are losing democracy in this country very quickly. It's very alarming. And groups like Moms for Liberty are just an outcropping of it. They're the inevitable result. They're enforcers, if you will.
They're the brown shirt, the blue shirts, the brown shirts, blue shirts. Yeah. Yeah,
but they're the blue shirts, who are like moms.
Yeah. What's hitting locally is why I'm interested in this, got interested in this, is these histrionic people commenting about the sex education curriculum at the local school district across the Narrows Bridge, which, by the way, has a wonderful new superintendent. I worked with her. Was a great teacher, principal. She's just quite remarkably good. But I can't imagine what's going through her mind with these groups, these parents, because they are Yeah, they're taking parts of the curriculum, and you're grooming kids, and it just goes beyond me. So I looked up this curriculum. I used to be director of research. I researched the curriculum. It's a great curriculum. It has value of having less STDs, less teenage pregnancies, higher, it's a research-based curriculum that does what it's supposed to do, which is educate teens and also make it so they're not going to be making bad decisions with sex and pregnancy.
Yep.
You would think that this is some sort of, pedophiles written. It just is beyond me how good they are at creating a moral panic over something so simple as a sex ed curriculum, which, by the way, if you don't want your child to be exposed to the curriculum, you can opt out of the curriculum. It's not a big deal. It happens all the time. Some parents it's not a big deal.
Satanic panic. It's the modern satanic panic. I mean, these people want to drag the country back, 50, 100 years. And that's, look, I believe firmly that the majority of Americans decided a long time ago that there are certain things that we want. We want public education in this country. We want a robust public education. We want a safety net. We don't want retirees or people who are of retirement age to not be able to retire and to have to die on the job or die homeless. We don't want that. But that consensus, right-wing capital interests in this country, a lot of those people who inherited their wealth, like Koch inherited his wealth. He's a malignant influence in this country, but his wealth is inherited. So he wants bootstraps for everybody else, but his father gave him $100 million or whatever. Like, that's these interests want to dismantle that state. It's about building generational wealth, and legacy. I think above everything else is legacy. That's what they're concerned with, and they don't care what the damage is that they do. And it's really unfortunate that parents are susceptible to their messaging, to these moral panics. They don't do the research themselves. They don't know what they're talking about. They're fed bullshit that confirms their biases. And so, it's a dangerous thing. And it's become sort of a religion for some folks, where they can't see outside of it. They can't step outside of it. And that's really dangerous. And we should have better laws in this country, aimed at misinformation and at the very least, truth in advertising. Like, we overhaul that, but you should not. A lot of politicking in this country is done in secret, behind closed doors. You don't know who's sending out what messages. Those messages can be destructive, especially, namely the anti-vax stuff, really destructive. And it's undermining our system, and sowing division and shredding our social contracts. It's wild to me that we are where we are. Public schools are the greatest accomplishment this country is, arguably the greatest accomplishment we've ever done. We have, and they are under attack.
Right.
Well, we can't be losing a democracy if democracy is supposed to be a system in which the will of the people. I agree with you that most people in this country want public education. They want better conditions. They want regulation. They want a safety net, and on and on and on. But they can't get it. They can't get it for whatever reason. So what kind of a democracy is that? If that's what we're losing, we're not losing much, because we're not getting national health care or Medicare for all. We're not getting more financial commitment to education. We're not getting a reduction in the military budget. On and on and on. I could go on, but so how do we go forward?
Well, I think we have to. That's a great question. I think that the answers to that it's multifaceted. Um, my sort of gut response is we take the blueprint that the right has followed, and we procedurally and with surgical precision undermine every step of it. One good thing we need to do is we have to overturn or reverse the Buckley versus Vallejo Supreme Court decision. We have got to end the farce that spending money is a form of speech that cannot be regulated or infringed at all. That as long as it's not direct spending, the outside spending, we can't limit it. That's nonsense. It is a perversion of the First Amendment. It is the absolute death of popular democracy. All it does is hand power to wealthy interests and give them a megaphone while drowning everybody else out. We have got to get rid of that decision. We have to, by whatever means necessary, you have to, you know, if I think that will probably happen first through the courts. So you got to target the courts. You got to get the right judges on. You have to do something about this Supreme Court. You need a code of ethics. Like there's so many, I mean, there's so many elements to it, but really I think it involves fixing the Supreme Court so that it's not stacked with these far right ideologues. um and then from there we can talk next steps, but that's really first and foremost. Now that could come through the Congress. We could add more justices, could rotate the justices. Um but the court is key to their strategy, and spending money is the bread, is their bread and butter. It's the backbone of their entire counter revolution. And if you overturn Buckley, if you get rid of that precedent, you gut their entire operation. All of this is immediately thrown into shambles,
Right.
and you leave them with very little recourse. So I think that's really what you have to do. You have to agree. You have to treat these right wing sort of billionaires like the threat to democracy that they are, and you have to go after their means of influence.
Oh man. Well, I'm glad that Greg sent me an article in preparation for this, that they're even Amanda Gorman, the wonderful young lady that read the poem at the inauguration, says successfully had her book banned in Florida. You know, um, it's just I'm sure it was because it made some people feel bad, and fitting into the critical race theory moral panic that we're trying to destroy the country and make people feel bad about racism.
I was just in Tulsa visiting my fiance's family, um, and we went to the Greenwood museum there,
Right,
the
right.
Black Wall Street Museum, and it's unbelievable. First of all, that this massacre um, happened and was just covered up, decades and decades and decades, just covered up. Um, and it's now there's an effort to bring light to it and expose it for what it was. Um, but you see the legacy of that. The museum does a great job of showing how the legacy of this heinous act of violence continues to this day. And the efforts to erase critical race theory from public schools, the efforts to ban books, are just the latest iteration of angry, small-minded, conservative, bigoted white folks trying to oppress, ignore, downplay, dehumanize uh, Black Americans in this country. It is a bloody legacy. It traces all the way back to the Confederacy, and even before that. And we like to think that we've come so far as a country, as a society, and we're still very much in our infancy. And I think that is sort of that's the lesson that I took from the museum and my own reading of history. And we have to fight back. We cannot let this go unchallenged. We cannot let them take over our institutions. We cannot let them operate in secret. That's what important context is about, is dragging these people who don't want to be highlighted into the light and showing them for who they really are, providing people with the important context so that they can be armed against the bullshit that is coming out of this dark money misinformation sphere. But this is a 5-alarm fire. We have got to. Everybody has a role to play in fighting back against this.
Right.
We have seen an unholy alliance on the right of capital, of white supremacy. In many ways, I think these groups are inherently or inextricably linked. Capital interests skews whiter for a reason in this country. But we all have a role to play in fighting this.
You were talking about sort of the craziness with the anti-vax thing. I was listening to Sagar and Crystal on their Breaking Points. I think it was yesterday or the day before. And they were talking about how Biden's being kind of rolled in these debt ceiling talks. And one of the concessions that the Republicans are asking for is to completely gut and dismantle the part of the government that brought us the vaccine, Operation Warp Speed. One of the few things that Trump did was remarkably well. They want to gut that whole. You can't make this stuff up. I don't get it.
What you have to understand is that this is not, in my opinion, and I want to stress that this is my opinion, but this is an effort to destroy everything in every part of our federal apparatus except the enforcement mechanisms to protect capital. All of it can go. They want to destroy all of it. They have no interest in the perpetuation, I think, of this country as it stands today. They want to reshape it, and if they can't reshape it, they'll just let it die. I'm terrified by what I see. They want these drastic cuts. People are already struggling. People have been struggling. Prices are high because of greedflation, and people have been struggling for years. I mean, most workers are living paycheck to paycheck in this country. Meanwhile, wealth is doing better than it ever has. We have Gilded Age levels of inequality in this country. It cannot sustain. And out of that, we are seeing these far right movements. And I think that those movements work out fine for capital because they're not going after these right-wing billionaires. But that's the end of democracy right there. If you let these people take over. I don't know. It's really frightening. It's much farther along than I think many people realize. Yeah.
I think I think in the end, you've got to look to two basic institutions that have always been there as we hope would be there as a guard against this, and that's trade unions and Democratic Party. And I think that we've seen this gradual and not so gradual tendency and trend to see the regulation and see the social net, et cetera, go away, and they've let it happen. I mean, they have really not reacted to it properly. They've been defanged, self-defanged, and they're not fighting for this. I mean, that's who else do we have that we could turn to but a political party and an institution that broadly represents working people. And I don't think they've done their job, frankly, and that's why it slipped away. You can blame the opposition, but that's the opposition's job is to win. But it seems
Yeah,
like our advocates, that's not their job to win. They don't
I
want to
think
win.
I think a couple things happened, which have disempowered the Democratic Party. Um, First of all, we've been talking about the counter revolution and how it has undermined our political institutions. Um, that hampers any kind of bold action today that the Democrats could take. Now, obviously, again, there are things that Biden could do to get out of this debt ceiling debacle. Whether or not the courts then allow that is an open question. I mean, we definitely have our hijacked right-wing judiciary. But I think what we can do is we can look back to the Buckley decision when we unleashed money in politics. And then we can see the neoliberal revolution, the 1980s. Reagan sweeps into power. He obliterates his Democratic opposition. He completes the realignment of Southern whites that began in the 1960s with the Southern strategy. Reagan has his own spin on the Southern strategy, and he completes that realignment. And the Democrats lose their stronghold, or what had historically been their stronghold, which is the southern states, which again goes back to the Civil War. Reagan had been Lincoln had been a Republican, and the southern states, of the Confederacy, were not going to vote for the party of Lincoln. But in the 1960s, you start to see that change, and actually, you could go back to Herbert Hoover. In the 20s, you start to see the Republicans making overtures to whites. Hoover had his idea for a lily white Republican Party. But in the 1960s, you really do get the Southern strategy. You have Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign, which is pretty is pretty explicit in his sort of support of the traditional social order, let's say. And Goldwater wins electoral votes in the Deep South. He's the first Republican candidate to do so in generations. But he ends up losing, and the realignment really begins with Nixon, and it gets interrupted again. It gets interrupted because of Watergate. So Nixon had won this sweeping victory. And then Watergate happens, and that's a hang up. So it all culminates with Reagan. What I'm getting at is that Reagan is the guy who delivers on the realignment. The Republican Party is ascendant. Neoliberalism, his idea, this free market bullshit, gets mainstreamed, and that's Democrats took notice. Out of they'd have no idea how to handle Reagan. And then you get Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton, his strategy is, we're going to out Reagan the Republicans. And I think, so there's what I'm saying is there's an ideological aspect of this for Democrats. There's a political aspect. They're afraid of the kind of backlash that they saw in the 1980s. You have a lot of older Democrats still in office who were alive then and remember it. And on top of that, there's the money, right? They unleashed the money, and so it's nice to be sort of on the take, I guess.
Well, I have some sense of hope with you, Walker. I mean, we don't have journalism that reports on local issues anymore. The only reason I found out about this because I happened to be watching YouTube at night. This isn't on in our newspaper. We used to have a reporter exclusively just for one school district. That was their beat. You can't find anything in the newspaper about school systems anymore. That's just gone.
Well,
So
local media has been bought up. A lot of it's been bought up by private equity and turned into just content mills for profit. And a lot of journalists are out of work today, and it's not great. It's hard. Look,
it's horrible,
it's terrible. It's a very difficult industry to survive in. I mean, OptOut is we're very small. Our budget is very small. We're doing the best that we can. Important context is new. I'm doing the best that I can, but yeah, it's hard out there. It really is. And the need for real journalism right now is so dire.
right,
It's like we don't have time for the industry to sort of figure itself out.
right,
We need real reporting.
right.
I appreciate you having me on. And
Reading your article, my mouth dropped about how ignorant I was, and how ill-informed I was for something so valuable as the health of a very good school district, which right now they're running school board members, and they're trying to get the school board members on that are going to ensure that their agenda is going to prevail. And it only takes a couple thousand votes to get somebody on a school board, so it's a big deal. And
yeah, they're throwing money at these races. They're throwing real money. And money talks. I mean, thankfully, Moms for Liberty has been. They haven't really been that effective. I mean, they've gotten 22, they got half of the people that they ran on, which is
right,
like, okay, 50-50. But for the amount of like attention that the group has, they are, it's not great, but it's okay. It reminds me that a majority of Americans today are not this radical, backwards sort of panicked, these sort of radicalized right wingers.
right.
But yeah,
It's a hothouse. It's a hothouse for future candidates. In other words, it's a good way to groom right wingers. They get involved in a winnable school board race, and they win, and you can kind of find some candidates for the future there, city council or county council, whatever.
Right.
I have to
that
say
well.
that I think this is all part of an emerging fascist movement in this country. That's my personal take on watching Moms for Liberty and watching all of these like right-wing groups that have been pushing COVID denial and also anti-trans stuff. I think the appeal of those groups and the crowd that is rallying behind them is a modern iteration of fascism. We're seeing radicalized right-wing people defacing stuff, LGBT stuff in Target. We're seeing moms yelling at school board members. We're seeing threats at school boards and at schools. It's slow, but it's very real. And I'm
Well,
sorry I cut you off.
Look what's happening in Hungary with Viktor Orban. What do they call that? Soft fascism or something like that? There's a term for it, but it worked. He's taken on he has the courts, he has the judiciary, he has everything. He's using this exact same playbook, and he's being brought to the Republican convention as a speaker. This is great, So, bad. I'm going to go stick my head in my gas stove and turn the gas on after this podcast. I tell you.
Open a bottle of wine.
Oh, maybe that's a better deal. Walker, you're wonderful. I am going to link to your stuff. I'm a follower of yours. I'm a subscriber. You are, and I'm glad you're on my radar. You're going to be one of my daily reads. So keep doing the good work. Thank you
for having me. I'm happy to be
very
here,
much.
and sorry for cutting you off. I feel bad.
No, that's all right. Thanks.
Very enjoyable discussion.